Okay, it's loud and clear now. Okay, if you could repeat all that you started the stream from.
Sure. Okay. So, me and Lucy thought we'd get together and do something special for the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, um,
Okay.
commemorating commemorating the Jewish residents of the Warsaw Ghetto, who in 1943 staged an uprising in order to try and prevent the mass deportation of the residents of the ghetto to death camps.
Well,
Treblinka.
sort of, but not quite. The goal was not actually to, at that point, the goal was not actually to prevent the deportation. It was more like an attempt to choose the place of death of those who decided to take up arms, you know?
Yes. So, I think we should probably want to start with a little bit of background about the ghetto itself.
Yes.
In 1939, Poland was the first country that was attacked and invaded by the German army. After a fairly lengthy campaign, Warsaw itself was captured.
Hmm.
Um, it took a couple of weeks. Warsaw itself was captured, and the year afterwards, in October, I think, October of 1940, they set up a isolated, walled-in area for
A
to
ghetto.
hold Warsaw's Jews, which
Yeah.
was a ghetto. So, uh, conditions inside this particular enclave were kept deliberately bleak. There
Yeah.
was
Well,
mass starvation.
there's there are a couple of things to that would explain it. Like the biggest factor that contributed to the to the situation in the ghetto being bleak was that a lot of people were cramped in a relatively small area. About 400,000 people were cramped within the Warsaw Ghetto. And actually, the Germans did use a sort of a official explanation as to why the wall was built. Are you familiar with?
No, why don't you go ahead with that?
It's like the Germans basically said that the Polish population must be separated from the Jewish population because the Jewish population spread disease. And the building of the wall was a sort of a quarantine that would separate those who were sick from those who were not.
Yeah, there was.
But there was
Yeah.
also, like, sorry to interrupt, a secondary, more like a very underhanded reason. It was framed as protecting Jewish people against the violence of Polish people.
To be clear, the Germans were not particularly well disposed towards non-Jewish Polish people either. So pretty quickly, uh, German intentions became clear after
Yes,
occupying Poland. They were attempting to reduce the Slavic people and the Jewish people to
that's right.
an effective a slave, a set of helots.
Yes.
Um,
And
so work camps became popped up and sprung up in death camps. Um,
of
so even
course,
though the ghetto is basically an extra level of horror on an already terrifying situation.
yes. And also Warsaw was a special city in some ways. Who is this guest? Tell them Lucy's chat welcomes them. Introduce yourself.
Hi,
We
sorry.
forgot about that part.
Fair enough. If you don't know, I'm DaedalusMedia, of the host of the Two Guys Talking History show over here on YouTube. We cover historical and contemporary events and attempt to kind of cut through efforts at censorship, particularly here in the United States, by the framing of teaching history as critical race theory. So that's pretty much what we're dedicated to, is trying to present a view of history that is not tainted by censorship.
Yeah, or trying to portray things in a different light than they actually were, right? Like
Yes.
it's not always censorship. Sometimes it takes the basically you can find many parallels between what's happening in the US and other right wing governments, right? When right wingers criticize critical race theory by saying, oh, there might have been racism, there might have been this or that, but, and they always add the but that is supposed to sort of make it less bad than it actually was, you know?
So there's been a concerted effort in the last couple of years, both here in the United States and in Poland, to reframe history to be more sympathetic to parties that do not necessarily deserve it. Um,
Yes, that's true.
so we do a couple of different shows every month here on our channel. I'm joined by another historian, a genocide scholar by the name of goes by Hetman,
Which
who
basically
focuses.
means like it was a military rank leader.
Yes, so we've been focusing pretty heavily on the war in Ukraine and a couple various topics in history. It's fun.
Yeah,
Come check us out.
very nice, very nice. And so I think, yes, Warsaw was a very special city because, as I've said on a couple of occasions, some estimates say that one third of the city was inhabited by Jewish citizens, and some estimates go as far as to say half of the city. So Warsaw was very entrenched in Jewish culture. You know, it was very much a Jewish city as much as Polish city, you know,
Yes.
which made it a very specific place. Like, there were people that actually, before being put in the ghetto, already lived in those places. Those were the so called lucky ones that had their own apartment that they already lived in. They had means to survive, usually much more than those people who were poorer and were just put into the ghetto without anything. And it is also important, like when we talk about the ghetto, that it all started with also things like the Germans restricting the amount of money that a Jewish person could have, the amount of money that a person could withdraw from the bank, you know, things that,
Life in the ghetto itself is heavily controlled uh, by the Germans. It
yeah.
was designed and calculated to crush the Jewish population there.
And of course, it was also a workplace. It was also a place where the so called shops were
Yes.
built, in which Jewish people would work and making various things like, you know, for the war effort. And of course,
Yeah.
to
So
add salt
it's
to injury. Yeah.
this was another source of slave labor. Germany used throughout both the occupied territories or even their satellite states, the Axis satellite states, extensively used slave labor to fuel their wartime economy.
Yes.
The ghetto was one such place where this was done. Um,
And of course,
there was deliberate starvation and medical experiments carried out here as well, similar to what you might find in accounts of the camps themselves.
yes. Between 1940 and 1942, it is estimated that about 100,000 people died of starvation. It is the so called first phase. It is like many people divide the eras of the ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto, into two phases: the phase of mass starvation and then the phase of mass death.
Yeah. So the ghetto was established 1940, late fall, October, and that first phase lasts from then that establishment till 1943.
Well, it was started in 1942 when the liquidation of the ghettos started.
Yeah, let's see.
And people started being taken to Umschlagplatz, from which they were taken to places like Treblinka and other death camps.
I'm pulling up this here, yeah. So from 22nd July until 12 September 1942, SS and police units carried out mass deportations and liquidated the ghetto,
Yes.
approximately 200,000. So there were two principal groups here that organized into fighters,
Mm-hmm.
and I do not know this accent, Mark. It's in English would be ZOB and ZZW.
Job.
Job.
Job, yeah.
Okay.
Job was the... I'm gonna look up the wiki for it. Because
Jewish Combat Organization. Here we go. Yeah, that's definitely something I can't.
Job means... Let me see. Because I actually... For Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa. The Ż stands for Żydowska, which is Jewish. Because in Polish, a Jewish person, Jew is Żyd. You know? So,
Yeah.
Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa. The Jewish fighting organization. At least I translated it that way. Let's see what the official English wiki calls it. Jewish Combat Organization. I was close.
And then the second one, this Jewish Military Union, ZZW.
ZW. There's also... There were a few of them. There were a few of those. And when it comes to the organization Job, a name seems to be... There's a certain name that seems to really repeat itself in the memories of those who survived and in documents, and that name is Zuckerman. Are you familiar?
Was
Did you come across that name when
nominal
you...
leader. Yes, the nominal leader of the organization.
Yes.
So they started doing prep work, at least they started doing prep work to resist in late 1942.
Keep in mind, there was a special talk among the top... All the parties, all the political parties, all the organizations of the ghetto had a meeting at some point. I have to remember when. And the sort of older people of those groups actually were against any sort of combative action. You know, they were against any sort of rising up in arms, that they should sort of accept their fate and wait for a better time, you know? And they talked how the Jewish people many times in history had to sort of accept their blood being spilled to await a better time, to preserve the core of the Jewish people, you know? And basically younger people did not agree with this sentiment as much and decided to go their way and create those fighting organizations.
So yeah, by and large, these groups were pretty sparsely equipped. They didn't have a lot of weapons. The account, or the couple accounts that I read for German accounts I read, had them armed with like handguns, Molotov cocktails, things of that nature. So these this wasn't particularly well equipped, and I do believe that the uh, Polish resistance, broader Polish resistance, smuggled in some weapons to them as well.
Some weapons, but it's a bit of a complicated topic. Like, there was a bit of a hesitancy between the broader Polish resistance and the ghetto resistance. There was like from what I understand, there was from the Polish resistance, mm, the army, the national army, I guess I could call the country army, the AK, sort of thought that there was this apathy among the Jewish people, and they did not have the will to act. And then the Jewish people sort of proved that they did have the will to act. And there was this also this interplay of, as young people, we want to act. We are Jewish, but we are also Polish. So the broader Polish sort of defiance group owe it to us also to share the weapons with us because we are fellow Polish people, you know?
Right. So there's kind of a couple different organizations that are working to resist in Poland at the time. The first is Polish civilians forming the imagined resistance, and then you have Jewish fighting groups in the ghettos, and then the third group is the Home Army, which is the remnants of Poland's army
Yeah,
that is either trying to escape Poland from 1939 onward and rally in places like the United Kingdom, where they formed their own units or fighter pilots.
that's
For
right.
example, um, who participated uh, in Allied actions alongside American and British units
Yeah.
throughout the rest of the war. For example, in Operation Market Garden, one of the units that takes part in the airborne campaign is a Polish regiment. Some of the best aviators fighting for the United Kingdom during the Battle of Britain are Polish fighter pilots as well.
Yeah.
So there's a very strong sense of resistance. They continue fighting long after their country's fallen. Another story I particularly enjoy is uh, they gave a number of Polish sailors a old British destroyer called the Piroon. During the campaign to sink the Bismarck in early 1941, a number of United Kingdom and Polish destroyers find the battleship Bismarck overnight, the night before the main British task force engages and sinks it.
Right.
The British commander gives the destroyers the order to shadow it and maybe harass it, fire torpedoes. The Poles pull up alongside Bismarck off hers and start shooting at her with their 5-inch guns. And they start flashing a Morse code, I am a Pole. And they spent the entire evening dodging in and out of the Bismarck's guns and shooting at it, even though they don't have sufficient caliber to sink the ship or even do significant damage. They just very much wanted to irritate that crew to death. So when the Bismarck gets into a battle the next day with the English battleships and cruisers, the entire crew hasn't gotten any rest because they've spent all night getting shot at by this tiny Polish destroyer.
Yeah. And of course, there's the whole thing with the Enigma code.
Yeah, they do hand over one of the early Enigma machines to the United Kingdom, I believe.
And of course, it led to a strong sense of betrayal after the war, you know?
Yes. Um, a lot of things go very wrong for Poland immediately after the war, not the least of which is the Soviet Union's betrayal of the Warsaw resistance fighters in 1944-45.
It is because Poland was basically given away as a um, Soviet Union satellite state,
Yes.
you know?
We are off of the ghetto at this point, though, so
Yeah, we must return. We must return.
we have to get back. So there's kind of two Warsaw Jewish Ghetto Uprisings. There's an early one in January, uh, where these groups, the ZOB and the CCW, start initially resisting the Germans, and they suffer pretty heavily. Uh, but they manage to wound or kill about a dozen Germans. Uh, After this, they began preparations in earnest for a much larger uprising. So they start constructing fighting pits and positions throughout the ghetto.
Yeah, and of
And they start organizing.
course, the second, like, it is important to note that the fight against the Nazis took many forms. It wasn't just oh, thank you, Valhalla. It wasn't just fighting with weapons. It was things like growing food, organizing, building bunkers for civilians that could not fight and hid underground and lived there. You know, it was creating support groups, which is a thing that we can learn from in the modern day.
Yeah, there was very much a sense of all of these residents being in this together, even if they're not actively participating in the fighting.
Yes. And there are many accounts of people who were hiding in the bunkers. I have read very from the person that still is alive today. She was 9 during the uprising, and she describes how she felt. She spent 9 months in the bunker, and she basically said that she was too small to comprehend fully what was going on, that she was emotionally distant to everything, that she operated on instinct. When it was hot, she needed to escape to where it was cold. When it was too cold, she needed to escape to where it was warm. And she sort of described, like, she described one incident, and this is, like, to me, a very important part of the ghetto, of those events, because this has this is like a wider message, a wider thing that applies to many situations today. She described how her father, who was a very respected man, um, very religious man, he was dressed in a traditional Jewish outfit. He had a very long, beautiful beard. And one day when he went out for a walk, he was very respected, and many people would come to him for advice when they didn't know what to do about things. He was like a very prominent figure within his own family as well. Everybody respected him. Everybody was always curious about what he had to say. And one day when he went out, some soldiers stopped him, cut, like, they cut off a big portion of his beard, and they demanded that he danced. And when he refused, they started humiliating him and beating him, like, in the middle of the street, and a whole crowd would gather. And that event would change him. He would become a different person from before. He would become very withdrawn, silent. He would never speak out about anything. He would become a shadow of himself, you know?
Yes, there is, I think, to get into it a little bit, and you might want to go further than that. The not Germans are not the only people who are responsible for the oppression in the ghetto. So occupation kind of functions at a lot of different levels, but you will
Yes.
oftentimes have locals who collaborate,
Yes.
and the ghetto is no different. There is members of Jewish individuals who were part of a ghetto police force
That's right.
established by the
There was a
locals.
Jewish police force.
So this is not this. At no point, if you ever take any accounts of the occupied Europe under the Nazis, is it ever kind of a clean everyone versus the Germans situation.
Yes.
There's a lot of shades of gray and complications that come into that.
But of course,
Uh,
there is one constant. There is one constant. Whenever there is a group that tries to cooperate with the Germans, that group inevitably ends up being murdered as well. So the Jewish police force also ended up being murdered or taken to the death camps when the Jewish ghetto was liquidated. And it also happened even during the time when Ukraine tried to join with the Germans to fight against USSR to gain freedom, you know? And this sort of thing also
Yes.
backfired because the Germans, of course, treated all people of these regions as subhuman. So, of course, they treated also Ukrainian people as subhuman and murdered them without any hesitation. And our teacher, our high school history teacher, who had a very, which can be pretty good, he had a pretty detached way of explaining history to us. And he explained that one of the reasons for the German downfall when it comes to the campaign on the USSR was their treatment of the Ukrainian people that were willing to fight alongside them against the USSR.
Yeah.
Was one of the main contributing factors to their downfall, since they sort of thrown away the capability of having like local hubs of support, so to speak, which
The
is,
Germans,
it turns out to be a good thing, but it is nonetheless the thing that happened, right?
the German racial ideology that was espoused by Hitler did not leave room for
Alliances.
anyone anyone that was not considered German enough. They used the term Aryan, which they
Yes.
stole from archaeology, and now we've had to change that term in contemporary archaeology. But the thing to keep in mind, I think, too, is this is kind of a facet of authoritarianism, is that authoritarianism is not necessarily set in stone. So you never know who's going to fall under its guns. You
Yes.
might be safe one day and not safe the next, because the nature of authoritarianism and the nature of fascism is to be an ever shrinking in group who is given power and safety.
And of
And,
course,
and this is something you see consistently in history, regardless of the authoritarian movement. You'll see this, in, for example, in the United States nativist movements. Who is
mm,
considered white, for example, at any
oh
given
yeah,
time can change dramatically. So,
yes,
like, there's no real good definition that you can give, and there's no real safety. So, even if you have like a case of like Jewish ghetto police officers, for example, you're never really safe.
yes, and Jewish people are usually not considered white either.
Yes, no, like that. Very rarely are Jewish people included as white in that category. And that's a pretty nebulous category to begin with. That doesn't really have
Yeah,
much
it's
force
like,
outside of a construct.
yeah, that is right.
It doesn't have much force outside of being a construct. So, like,
And you add also this myth to the, it was to build up on this. There's this myth, and I'm actually really glad that a big streamer like Vosh is doing his work to deconstruct that myth. The myth of a strong, powerful, organized regime under a big, powerful authority figure. You know, there's this myth of Hitler ruling the Nazi party with an iron fist, being the ultimate leader who has everything in control, while in reality, it was a bunch of departments who basically fought for control and political power. And there was Hitler who basically sort of navigated between them and played his games between them to sort of keep it all together.
Yeah, a dictatorship is almost always
He
a
was,
coalition
he
effort.
was, yeah, he was not as firmly in control as people tend to believe he was. You know, it was a very delicate balance of, you know, playing the political games of people like Goebbels, Himmler, and all the other
Yes. So
top.
what ends up happening, like especially like Germany being one example, you have like the Wehrmacht, the military, the army, the navy, and the air force, and that's separate from the SS, who they're
Yes,
competing with, who's separate from the Abwehr, which is the German military intelligence organ, who they're competing with. And all these different groups are competing with one another for pride, prestige, and resources. And this compounds and creates errors. So there's no real one unifying driving force, and Hitler
yes,
was very kind of wishy-washy and prone to listening to the last person who gave him advice. So
yeah.
there was always this kind of effort by all of the top Nazis
To one
to
up
trip
one
over
another.
themselves to be the last guy to
Yeah, to one up one
the
another.
word.
Yeah. There's a good comment from Valhalla. It's what the white nationalists don't understand. Not all white people are the same. Different cultures, etc. The only need for white as a category is for supremacy reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, there
Oh,
really isn't.
Valhalla asked, is there a new chat? Yes, I have a White Forest page. I have joined the White Forest family along with Demon Mama Vosh and many others. It's true.
Yes. Yeah, there's very much a the concept of whiteness isn't really rooted in any kind of cultural background,
Or any sort of, well, yeah, you're right.
or at least any kind of unified cultural background. It gets kind of contrasted, in at least here in the United States, with black culture. But one of the things that I usually like to point out to people is you have entire generations who are uprooted from their uh, Africa and brought over here as part of the slave trade. They had to build a culture where they were.
Right.
Um, but like for white Americans or people who are considered white, there that really isn't an issue. Like cultural celebrations are pretty common throughout the country. Like
But
every
there's of course the issue that there is no such thing as white culture to begin with. European culture is a, as most cultures are, to be honest, are a mishmash of influences from all over the globe, you know,
yes,
of historical movements of peoples, trade, cultural exchange, it all mixes and matches, you know?
yeah, there's no like people talk about a sense of purity, and that doesn't really exist.
It
You
doesn't.
you have a lot of mixing and a lot of people taking a lot of different influences to
Yes.
arrive at
The
what their cultural heritage is.
culture is an ever changing thing that sort of interacts with everything, you know? You could say that culture, technically speaking, is everything that surrounds us at all times, you know?
Yes.
Like everything is political, but also everything is culture, basically. And it's in constant flux, you know? There is no such thing as a stagnant culture.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk around culture, but you're always going to find it changing,
Yeah,
growing, and I think that's a generally a good thing.
it is a good thing. Yeah. And I don't mind people sort of uh, appreciating things from the past or certain customs, but I think that is a thing that is part of a human heritage rather than some artificially segregated thing that needs to be preserved and locked in time. You know,
Yes.
there was a great example of that when there was like the tea ceremony thing from Japan, right? There were Japanese people presenting it, and they said by the end of their presentation something that I found to be really interesting. They said many young people in Japan are not quite interested in the ceremony, so we're sort of happy that people around the world are interested in preserving the thing, you know?
Yes.
So I think that we can appreciate many of those things were emergent from the artificial establishment of the nation states in the 19th century, you know, and by retroactively rewriting history as a straight path to a nation state, you know?
Yeah. So academically, historians are trying to get away from that a lot.
Yeah, I know. That's a really good thing, you know?
Yeah.
But in common parlor, when politicians discuss history, they usually discuss it in terms of everything past countries, past cultures that are being part of the heritage of the nation state.
Yeah. There's a very much, especially in contemporary politics, a desire to reach back to the past in order to legitimize the present.
Yes. And I tend to go pretty extreme to say that, for example, in the past there was the Kingdom of Poland, but the Kingdom of Poland, which was part later of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, was a very different construct than the nation state Poland, you know?
Yes, it's not really a straight line to get to any country.
Yeah, because it was called the Kingdom of Poland, sure. There were Polish people living there, sure. But there were also Jewish people living there, the Tatars, the Germans, and many other peoples living in that space, equally being parts of it, you know?
Yeah, borders are by and large arbitrary, so you're going to find people who speak different languages, for example,
Yes,
spread out everywhere, especially in Europe, where countries tend to be a lot smaller
yeah,
overall.
yeah. And you have, but yeah, let's get back to our ghetto.
Yes. So 1943 in January, there's this early attempt at a revolt. After this happens, the Jewish resistance groups start cleaning house. They start finding collaborators, executing them, uh, in preparation for and preparing these fighting positions and preparing bunkers and safe spots for civilians who are
Yes.
not engaged. So they are at getting ready to start something much bigger, and that happens in April 19th. Hang on,
Hmm.
I got notes. Yes, April 19th. The SS and German police and forces enter the ghetto and are preparing to start another round of deportations. And this is when the groups start their main revolt.
Oh, I think there's like continue, and I will add a thing.
So this is when they start their main revolt. Uh, they start ambushing these police forces as they're moving through the ghetto. They start tossing Molotov cocktails, and this is much bigger than the first round. So the Germans suffer a lot more casualties, and they start to understand that they're going to have to bring more resources in to escalate the situation, and this because the situation is escalating.
Hmm.
So they bring in armored cars, uh, and they start replacing commanders in order to in order to get control of this situation. And at points, they bring in aircraft to bomb resistance positions.
Right.
And bit by bit, the Germans start to overrun individual fighting positions in the ghetto.
Yes.
Um, the entire event keeps on going till about mid-May. Yeah, May 16th is when the last position is overrun, and then for good measure, the Germans destroyed the synagogue in Warsaw.
Yes, blow up. And of course, once the uprising has failed, the ghetto was burned building by building.
Yeah, so about 50,000 individuals are deported or killed during this. The resistance organized something along the lines of over 600 individual fighting positions.
And many people, like those who survived, escaped to the so-called Aryan side.
At this point, the ghetto is effectively liquidated.
Yes.
Either the ghetto itself is destroyed, and everyone inside of it has either been deported, killed, or fled.
And I also wanted to point out a very um, important thing about the uprising. The the uprising started on the day of the Passover celebration. You know about it?
Yes, Passover itself is the Jewish celebration of the liberation from slavery in Egypt.
Yes. So it had this symbolic thing that was to be utilized in this uprising.
Yeah, it's like both. This is like both on the Germans' intention to just inflict a humiliation on the Jewish population, like going in on this holy day or set
Yes.
of holy days rather, and uh, exercising deportations and kill them. And
Yes.
this is kind of this point of pride for this population that they engage in the first place, and that they decide to choose what happens to them.
Yes. And of course, there's a lot of things related to the escape from Egypt. Like you have mm, the usually, I'm not sure how was the policy of the more progressive synagogues, but you have men usually have this piece of like a this thing tied around your arm and a scroll on your forehead, and there's talk of like the escape from Egypt and that you give your mind and your heart to God.
Yes, it's very fundamental to Jewish theology is the whole concept of the Exodus from Egypt and the prior efforts on God's behalf to get Moses acts on God's behalf to convince Pharaoh to free the Egyptian people, or excuse me, the Israeli people, the
Yeah.
Israelites.
So yeah.
It's a highly symbolic holiday for the
Yeah.
whole faith,
Yeah.
and it speaks, I think, to the cruelty of the Germans that they choose to engage in this way and choose to engage when they did.
Yeah. And of course, for the longest time, the many people were rounded up to the Umschlagplatz, but as I've said before, there were instances because it was framed as a trip to be able to work, as the famous writing on in Auschwitz says, Arbeit macht's frei, right?
Work
And
makes free.
yeah, and many people were so starved, so desperate that they would go to the Umschlagplatz on their own to get the scraps of food that were giving out there to people. You know?
These conditions are like truly appalling, uh, all up and down.
Yes. They're like, well, I'll be probably talking about, I'll be translating the stories of individual families for the videos, but there's like one person who, as I've told you, there was a one person who was hired under a German company, and then they took on their relative. His German was flawless. He had fake papers. And within that German company, he started his own company and started hiring people, other Jewish people, under false documents to that company. And the interesting thing, and that company functioned on the eastern parts of the country. And the interesting part about it is like there's a lot of irony here. This company was doing so well that it was considered a crucial company for the war effort, you know?
Yes.
And under this company, Jewish people were hired. Like, what during the liquidation of the ghetto, the person decided to help his family from the ghetto. There were people that he was not able to help. They were taken to the Umschlagplatz, but a lot of them were able to get into the company under false names, etc., get work there, and they survived the war.
Yeah. Both in the ghetto and broadly throughout occupied Europe, there were a large number of individuals who risked a great deal to smuggle out or save Jewish individuals during the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Today, the Israelis refer to them as the righteous among nations,
Yes.
those individuals who put
Apparently,
themselves.
the biggest amount among them are Polish people.
Yes.
But there were also, and this is where the discussion begins that the current Polish government will not want you to have. There was also a substantial number of people that were the so-called blackmailers, you know, that would sell Jewish people out to authorities. Like one of the saddest stories was, and it's in one of the newer interviews, that there was a person who would help a Jewish family. He would help them, he would hide them, and then his own son would bring authorities to arrest and murder not just the Jewish family, but his own father as well. You know?
Yeah. So, like, if you were caught assisting targets of the Holocaust, not just Jewish targets, anyone, you yourself could find yourself subject to being sent to a camp
Or just killed.
or arrested,
Yes.
or just outright killed.
Yeah. Because street executions were a regular thing in Warsaw as well.
While we're on that topic, you wanted to discuss
Yeah.
uh, Professor, where is?
Barbara Engelking.
Yes.
Okay. So as we know, that sort of to give like a brief summary of what happened. Barbara Engelking during like an interview for the private TV station called TVN, which is actually owned by a US company, which is interesting because the Polish government is constantly trying to liquidate private media, to liquidate the media that are free from the government's grasp, so to speak. And they tried to liquidate TVN, and TVN was like, wait a minute. You can't just do that. There are international deals involved here. It's not exactly something that you can just, do, you know? Like there are
Right.
actual big international deals involved here. And so during that interview, she said that there was a sense of disappointment within the Jewish community and that Polish people could do more to help Jewish people during the events of the Holocaust. And this caused an outrage from the government that said that she should apologize. They sued the TV station because it was the perfect opportunity to continue the attack on the free media, right? And the most recently, the Minister of Education, by the surname of Czarnek, has announced that he will, unless she's fired from the Polish Institute of Sciences, that he will cut funding from the institute. So basically, this is where we're at. Actual censorship.
Yeah, hi Bluestone, how you doing? Yeah, no, there's definitely a problem in Poland right now. They have a very aggressive far right government.
Yes.
We're working to lock down control of the country.
And the sad thing about it is, sorry to interrupt once again, it is a very far right government, but there is an even more far right there's an even more far right party that is looking to gain power in Poland. Right now, Law and Justice Party is in charge, but there is a party that is right now the third power in the country that is called the Confederacy. It seeks to gain power, and that party is far more to the right from the current far right party. To give you a taste, this party says that Poland should not support Ukraine in the war. This party says that divorce should not be a thing. This party says that, of course, it's anti Semitic, like the Jewish people should not be part of Poland, and many, many very wild things like that, you know? So the situation is in Poland is very bad, but it can rapidly get a lot worse still.
Yeah, that kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier with authoritarianism and an ever shrinking group in Europe. Like, you're always going to find somebody who thinks the last set of guys didn't go far enough.
Yes. Oh, I don't.
With Confederacy being tied at the worst people you know. Well, Confederacy is a system of organization that's not particularly popular.
I don't remember if the Germans had a separate designation for Jewish people that were important to the war effort. They kept thinking White Star for some reason. Well, the person that I mentioned that had a company, he didn't do it as a Jewish person. Oh, a brief pause.
Sorry, Avery, come here. Come here.
Okay, so the person that I mentioned did not operate as a Jewish person. He operated on false paperwork as a non-Jewish person. It is important to mention because technically speaking, all Jewish people were part of the war effort because all Jewish people were forced to work in the shops in the ghetto, you know? So, technically speaking, there were no Jewish people that were not important for the war effort because all of them were used as slave labor to further the war effort. You know?
Right. There's not really a separation between the two. What you have is individuals forging documents in order to as uh, operate without the stigma placed by the Nuremberg laws on Jewish people.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, it's we are, as the media says, we are closing in on a second Nuremberg with the whole Ukraine situation.
Uh, there's a so like you were speaking about that party previously, and I'm willing to bet that if we get drilled down on that party's resources and access to funding, that you're probably going to find some Russian oligarch at the other end of it.
Yeah,
Um,
probably. Like the nice thing about this is like during the celebration of, well, the celebration is not a good word. Anniversary of the 80th, like yeah, the and the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the topic of Ukraine was raised quite a few times during the speeches of people during the celebration. Like Marian Tursky, who I keep referencing because he's a very inspirational figure who survived the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, said, I've been liberated by the Red Army from the death camp, and I will always be grateful for that. But does that mean that I should be silent and indifferent when Russia is invading Ukraine and committing atrocities, committing mass murder? No, I cannot be indifferent when this sort of thing happens. I have to speak out, you know?
Yes.
And there's like the president of Warsaw gave a whole speech how Warsaw was completely destroyed, like that there was a Jewish city that Jewish people being killed was ripping out a part of the heart of Warsaw. And he added that that is why Warsaw is a city that will help, that understands the pain of the cities being destroyed in Ukraine. And that is why Warsaw will keep helping Ukrainian people and, supporting in the war effort. Like the topic of Ukraine has been raised quite a few times during the anniversary of the Ghetto Uprising.
There's a very, very close kinship, I think, between Poland and Ukraine.
Yeah, but there's a very complicated history as well.
Yes, and
Which,
there's also a very considerable close kinship between both countries' Jewish populations
yes, that's right.
together.
That's right. That is
So,
correct.
um,
There is a doggy. Yeah.
yes, he's a good boy. He's
This is the first time that I've managed to actually do a call on stream with someone when I'm visible on your end and you're visible on my end. Usually it's not like that. So this is the first time when I've managed to do it like that.
yes, this is Avery. He's a very good boy. He's just sometimes a little scared.
And a bit ill right now from what I know.
Yeah, unfortunately, he's a little bit sick. He's getting himself chicken and rice for dinner.
I had chicken and like pasta for dinner, so similar. And since I had that throat trouble, I cannot have it with any strong spices. I have to have it like delicately boiled or something.
Yeah, he's a good boy.
True. The only thing Russian oligarchs are good at is hijacking populist movements. True. That is true. You disappeared. Uh oh. I think Discord has restarted. One moment, everybody. We will return to what happened. Like, Discord just restarted. Oh my gosh. What happened to Discord? I'm going back to the hello?
Hello.
Hello. My Discord just restarted.
Yeah, I figured. But
And now I have to get you back.
yeah, we are.
How do I do that?
All right, go to.
You're not on anymore. I don't know why.
I probably knocked out the window capture when you left Discord. So go to add source in OBS.
Hey, let me. Oh, I know. Okay, I understand. Wait. Where is the conversation? I have
Window
to.
capture.
I think I have to pop you out again.
Yes. And
Where is?
then,
I don't see the option anymore. Oh, there you go. You're popped out. Your full screen. Are you back on? You're back on the screen. Yes, you're back. Very nice.
all right, yes, I'm there. I need you to turn your camera on again in the chat so it's on my end too.
Oh, oh, you're right. I got AFK'd. Okay. Why did I get AFK'd? How can I? That is so. But actually, my whole Discord actually restarted as well.
Yeah, sometimes Discord dies like that. You should
Okay,
just
let
have to
me
turn your
see.
camera back on and it will go.
Wait, let me. Where are you?
There we go.
Yeah, I'm back.
All right, we're good. Yes. Sorry
Okay,
about that, everybody.
let me see the. Oh my gosh, where is it? Okay, that's good. You know, one day when I get 50 people in the audience, I'm then gonna show myself to the audience.
That was a good goal, everybody.
But yes, there's a lot of parallels that we can draw from the past to the present, and it's important to do so. It's important not to compartmentalize this. It's important not to isolate this to this thing happened here only to this group and is only relevant to this group, and it could only happen in this particular circumstance, and it's the past and nothing else. Like, we cannot compare it to any other discrimination.
Yes. The other thing I think I would point out is I noticed, and we did it. Me and Hetman did a show on this not too long ago. Is there seems to be a connection between individuals who idolize the Nazis, the American Confederacy in our Civil War, and the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. There
Hmm.
seems to be a overlap of people who support all three groups, unironically. And amongst those individuals, there's kind of this distortion of history where they distort the American Civil War and they distort World War II and they distort this current crisis or the current war in Ukraine.
Of course, there's a whole subsection of people who consider themselves a left-leaning socialist slash communist who really horribly are pro-Russia, you know?
Yes. That's also another entirely separate group from what I'm talking about. These are largely right wing groups. You see this confluence of supporting losers. Let's be honest.
They sort of weirdly end up being allies when it comes to the topic of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, and like that's I think a really good example of why we need to understand history and not aim to obscure it and not aim to try and recontextualize it in ways that aren't true.
Yeah,
Like you have Russia, you have Putin and Russia's state media trying to proclaim that Ukraine is not a viable state, it isn't a
yeah,
real state, and that's part of Russia. When you have this very rich history of Ukrainian independence and
yeah.
independence movements.
Of course, technically speaking, you could very well say that about many countries, because many like nations, like the idea of a nation states and nationalities was like born in the 19th century, you know?
Yes.
And
Very
yeah,
modern concept.
and of course, but because like you had in this case, you had this big country called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which encompassed Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus, right?
Yes. And
And
even more than that, you have a lot of movement inside the Polish-Lithuanian
yeah,
Commonwealth of populations of
yeah.
speaking.
Tatars, the biggest Jewish community in the world at the time, and many other, you know. And like it caused a few things. First of all, it caused after World War One, when national identities were forming, it caused war over which of the terrains of the Commonwealth should belong to which newly formed nation state, right?
Yes.
And it also, because keep in mind, the argument of a country being a fake country that should not exist was also used against Poland after World War One, right? Poland was basically called a fake country created by the Versailles Treaty.
Yes. The Versailles Treaty treats Poland, and Germany took some exception to this, particularly the Danzig corridor outside between Germany and Kaliningrad, modern
Yeah,
Kaliningrad.
yeah. And of course, there's the Gdansk or Gdansk that was a free city before World War II, right?
Yes.
It was
Up until
technically.
the point where the Germans shelled it. Um,
And of course, it's all very. It's not a simple thing because Gdansk was a free city and it enjoyed its status as a free city. And it was a majority German population place, you know? Most
yeah,
citizens of Gdansk were German. And of course they wanted to remain a free city, right? But these sort of conflicts of what part of a country should belong to where were really complicated because of that topic that I've told you of the bigger commonwealth, that sort of where separate identities formed. For example, I tend to ask, you know, that Vilna, how is Vilna in English?
VIL. I think it's just Vilna.
Is it? I think it's a bit
Let me
different.
check. Vilnius. You're talking Lithuania, right?
Yeah, Lithuanians, um,
Vilnius. I gotta
the
check Vilnius.
capital of Lithuania.
Pronunciation. Thank you. Vilnius.
Vilnius. Like, I tend to ask, so after World War One, what country Vilnius should have went to which newly formed nation state? Poland or Lithuania? Where should it have gone after
It
World
ended
War
up.
One?
It ended up in Lithuania.
No, it ended up in Poland after World War One. Yeah.
Really?
Yes, after World War One, it was part of Poland. Actually, the city was a majority Polish population city, even though historically it was part of the Great Duchy of Lithuania, you know? Because those things were different back then. And there was conflict between Lithuania and Poland, and not exactly. It wasn't Lithuania at first. It was it was nothing at first, and then after World War One, the borders were forming, the countries were forming, and there was a conflict between Poland and Lithuania about where this place would go. And it was a majority Polish city at the time. So the citizens of the city wanted to be actually part of the newly formed Polish nation state, you know? And during World War II, the place was sort of taken over by the USSR,
The
and
Soviet Union annexed all three Baltic
so
nations.
and the Soviet Union, yes, took it and made it part of Lithuania, de facto the USSR, right? And of course, changed the demographics of the city completely, right?
1918 to
It
1920.
was changed from a majority Polish city to a not a majority Polish city. A similar situation was with Lviv, Lvov, you know? It was a
Yes.
complicated thing. It was a many people try to frame it as Poland invaded Ukraine and took Lviv, and it was not exactly like that, you know? It was a situation
Right.
of Lviv itself being a majority Polish city and all of the surrounding areas around Lviv being a majority Ukrainian areas, right? And now the question is, where should the terrain go to, right? And becomes
Okay.
a really complicated question in the context of nation states, right?
Yeah, like where a city or a given area ends up is not necessarily going to be a majority speaking area too at any given time, because though because this concept of nations, we have to remember, is an artificial one.
Yeah,
Uh, and Russia, in particular, particularly as an empire, uh, does a very, very good job of sort of shifting populations around,
yes,
and then after the fact, trying to use this as a justification
yes.
for uh,
That in this case,
acts of imperialism.
I'm sort of talking about the fact that Polish people, Lithuanian people, Belarusian people, and Ukrainian people used to occupy a single sort of composite state. The term for what the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was is that composite state, right? And then
Yes.
fractured into separate nation states and conflict arose, you know?
Yeah, and Poland. So, like Poland, Lithuania is actually a fairly substantial state too, um, especially in 17th or 18th century Europe. They occupy a fairly considerable amount of territory, and
Hmm? What do you mean?
Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it's a very substantial state, and it's not widely discussed in the United States when we talk about history.
Well, it is a bit of a not correct framing that Lithuanian occupied terrain, you know? You know what I mean?
No, Lithuania was a duchy, so it was a component of.
Yeah, because some people frame incorrectly basically the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth as Poland colonizing Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, and that is not the
No,
case.
it's
And
a little bit more complicated.
it is a very no, it's a very it frames the history of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth from the perspective of nation states, which is a mistake to begin with. You know,
Yes, it's not. It's not a traditional nation state.
it was a composite state, right?
Yeah, it's not. It's not. It's not a state in the very Fabian sense. It's more
It
of
wasn't
a grouping.
like um, it was a country that had a system of estates. An estate
Yeah.
was basically like a social class, right?
Yes, it's more of a grouping of different societies almost
Yes, like
coming
the
together.
nobles, the peasants. The groupings were not based on nationality, right? A noble that was Polish would not feel closer to a peasant because he was Polish as opposed to a Lithuanian noble. No, he would feel closer to the Lithuanian noble because they were two both nobles, you know, from the Commonwealth. There was no sense
Yeah.
of solidarity on national lines, you know?
Yes. Interestingly enough, in the United States, anyway, at least in Illinois, where I originally come from, there is a statewide holiday for Casimir Pulaski, who was
Yes.
a Polish Lithuanian general who came over here during our Revolutionary
And
War.
created the cavalry.
Yes, trained our cavalry. I swear to God, every year when that came up, people would always ask me, who is this guy and why are we getting the day off?
Yeah,
That's
and
how poorly we teach the topic. Even in a state like Illinois, where we have a huge Polish population in Chicago.
Kazimierz Pułaski received a special citizenship as apparently one of only few people in the history of the US. You know?
Yes, he was highly. There was a couple European officers who came over. Von Steuben, for instance,
There
came
was
over and taught us
also
how to drill.
Tadeusz Kościuszko, a very famous Polish figure, who also, well, let's go back to Puławski for a bit, because the interesting factoid about Puławski is that he was intersex, you know?
Yeah, I did not know that.
Kazimierz Puławski was intersex. He was judged to have had a skeletal build of a woman, you know?
Yeah, I did not know that.
That's like one of the people that helped form the country was intersex. So I guess the US is baked like the LGBT forms the foundation of the creation of the US.
Don't tell the Republicans; they'll go nuts.
True. And there's the Tadeusz Kościuszko, who famously, when leaving the US after the revolution, right, he left a will in which he said that the slaves should be freed, that his estate should be sold, and his wealth should be used to free the slaves and to give them education. You know, very anti-slavery. And it's funny because many Republicans and many far-right Polish people were saying that the statue of Tadeusz Kościuszko was toppled by BLM protesters, and there were signs on the statue, right? Writings on the statue, right? Sprayed.
Right.
And historians pointed out, well, sure, but Tadeusz Kościuszko, the actual person, would not only not care about the statue, but would probably march with BLM, you know?
Almost certainly, yes. Uh, very like Polish Lithuania is a very interesting. Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth is a very interesting period. Um, like it's also a kind of unique set of organization for Europe for the time too.
Yeah, it was. This is why I have to do streams explaining it. That was not Poland, you know?
Yeah, like it's a much more complicated relationship than most nation states ends up being.
Yeah.
On top of what's already a very complicated relationship.
And I think that is part of the shared origin between Poland and Ukraine, you know?
Yes,
And it,
Ukraine and Poland are both kind of very similar in how they kind of form this kind of highway through Central Europe too.
yeah. And of course, it directly defeats the notion that Ukraine is a fake place, that it's Russian. It's like the history of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth directly defeats that argument, you know?
Yeah, and that gets back to Russia trying to obscure these things uh, in order to justify their current imperial ambitions.
Yeah. And of course, there is an important, because Russia has um, imperialist. Am I still on? Am I still connected? Can you still hear me?
You are. You're still here.
Okay.
Let me check your
So
stream too.
Russia has imperialist ambitions towards many countries, but it has a very special relationship when it comes to Ukraine. A very special negative relationship. And that is that there are serious theories that Ukraine is a existential threat to Russia, if that makes sense. In Russia's mind, Ukraine is an um, existential threat to Russia, to the Russian soul, to the Russian spirit. Ukraine was
At
part
least
of,
as they see it right now.
yeah, it was the Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth longer period of time than it was part of Russia. That is correct. And do you know what I mean when I say that Russia considers Ukraine as an existential threat to itself?
Yes, they so Putin and Russia in particular is trying to present Russia in a particular light that the existence of Ukraine contradicts.
It goes back further than Putin.
Yes,
Like,
and you have so Russia is an outgrowth. The Muscovy area is an outgrowth of Kiev itself, and where you see this emergence of their civilization is in Ukraine.
yes. And sort of the Duchy of Moscow sort of wanted to frame itself as the uniter of all of the old Kiev Rush, you know? And there was a big problem because the Duchy of Moscow for the longest time was under the influence and occupation of the Mongolian Empire, right?
Yes,
Which was very despotic when it comes to its rule. And what is now Ukraine
Duchy
was,
of the Duchy of Muscovy inherited that particular tendency as well.
yes. And the language became influenced by it as well. And Ukraine, what is now Ukraine, was part of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And because of the specific nature of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, many laws that were placed by the nobles, like the law of respecting the other, the law that forbade, like that, it was sort of forbidden by law to trample the cultures on and other things of the individual regions of the Commonwealth, you know. It was forbidden. The the nobles made it so that an effort to centralize the country was impossible, you know,
Yes,
culturally and like it was out of self. Yeah, it was out of. Sorry.
it's a very cosmopolitan state for the time, especially, and you have a lot of different cultures who resisted heavily the influence of Western Christianity,
Yeah.
which tended to homogenize the cultures that they gained influence in.
Yes.
That just didn't happen in the
It was.
Lithuanian
It was
Commonwealth.
interesting enough. Every like it wasn't all made out of the will for it to be like nice and good. It was more, it was all made in the self interest of the nobility class itself, you know, in the
Yes,
interest of the golden freedom of the class of the nobles. But it ended up in practice being forbidding discrimination based on religion, which is why the Jewish community could thrive in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. It ended up being like the Lithuanians, which were the Belarusians and Ukrainians, being able to, you know, have their language and sort of for it to be able to flourish, right?
yes. There's also a lot of surviving customs here in Eastern Europe that because of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth survived to this day in
Right.
one form or another, that did not survive in France and the Holy Roman Empire and
Right.
etc. Because of this kind of disjointed, dis not disunified, but like because they are looking to regard each individual culture as a component of the state as opposed to a
Yes.
single unifying culture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it becomes part of that whole threat because Ukrainian, what is now Ukrainian, could flourish in the Commonwealth, and Russian was sort of under heavy influence of the Mongolian Empire. Theoretically speaking, Ukrainian is more Russian than Russian is. And you can see why this would be like become a problem for the Russian spirit, you know?
Yeah, especially with this presentation of this modern idea of Russia, that Russia likes to try to decontextualize local histories in order to justify their ambitions.
Yes,
And you just Eastern Europe is really hard to do that in because there's a very long tradition of Eastern Europeans resisting those efforts.
yes, that's right.
Like for Lithuania, for instance, strongly resisted the Teutonic Knights when they tried to launched effectively a
Yes,
crusade into the region.
that is also what brought the Kingdom of Poland and the Duchy of Lithuania closer together to form its union. Those sorts of dangers.
Yes,
But yeah, there's like a lot of, and I really like the fact that the anniversary related things, like that the topic of Ukraine and like the atrocities done in Ukraine are being discussed a lot, you know?
yes. I have a feeling when all of this is over, that there's going to be quite a lot of tragedy that gets exposed in Ukraine on top of what's already been seen.
Yes, and of course, there'll be like, I've made a whole, uh, I think there's like I think it's uploaded already, a segment on the ecocide that is happening in Ukraine and how it's the most documented ecocide in like the history of war, I think, and that it will be used to demand payment from Russia, but it will also be used to expand the definition of ecocide to start holding, for example, companies that hurt the environment accountable for what they're doing.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a dramatic change in certain aspects of international law as a result of this conflict. Um,
Like,
there are a lot of gaps that they might be able to find some justification for plugging.
yeah. And of course, like some environmental damage is irreparable in Ukraine. So,
Yes, there's going to be very significant cleanup costs too. The economy of Ukraine is seen a precipitous drop since the commencement of the Russian special operation.
yes.
And that's on top of the damage that was already happening since because they've been fighting a war in Ukraine since 2014.
Yes.
So like there's a certain perception I see that people are like, oh yeah, this has been a year. No, it's been 7. It's been quite some time. A lot of fighting.
Yes. And of course, the whole thing is treated a bit differently over here and probably in the US. From what I'm hearing, the topic of Ukraine is slowing down in the US a bit.
Depends.
when it comes to the general public?
Yes, very much so. Especially as we're starting to look at the presidential election more
Right.
and more for next year's election.
Because, like, how often is it mentioned? How often is the topic of Ukraine breached?
So far, it's effectively ended, except for Republicans trying to use it as a wedge issue. So there is a desire by Republicans to not send over additional resources.
Oh,
Um,
that's
so
bad because
they're going to campaign on it, I think.
Ukraine should get like 10 times more, to be honest. But
Yes.
like in Poland, it's very much an active topic. Like every day in the news, you like there's an update of what's happening. Like it's a topic that is basically discussed every single day in the media in Poland.
Yeah, and there's also like I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I'm a lot more keyed into military think tanks and military scholars, and that's still a topic of discussion for all of us, um, every day, all the time. But the general public is kind of falling by the wayside a bit. The only time it really comes up is they will announce new arms packages for Ukraine.
Oh, because like I saw Anastasia write on Twitter about a place being attacked and people dying and being hurt, right?
Yes,
And then I basically saw the story spoken about in the news, in the media, you know?
yes, and the United Kingdom is covering it pretty well too, the BBC and Sky News. But it is fun, and I don't watch American cable news. I detest most American cable news to begin with.
Hmm.
Um, but I do believe it's being covered on CNN.
Okay. Well, that is good. That is good indeed. I'm working on because I've taken part in a march from Pauline. Do you know what Pauline is?
No,
The Museum of Jewish History in Poland.
there are a couple different Holocaust organizations, aren't there, in out of Poland?
Yeah, but there's this huge museum of Jewish history in Poland. It is called the Pauline Museum.
Let's pull that up. Hang on. No, Museum Poland.
Yeah, Pauline.
Polin.
Yes,
Okay. Is on the site of the former Warsaw Ghetto.
yes. It's a really wonderful place. It has a lot of events. It is a permanent display, which is really good. And it has a lot of scientific and other types of events going on. And it has a lovely restaurant inside of it. But the march started from Pauline, and we went from a monument to a monument of the ghetto. And each time there was a small prayer in both in Polish and in Hebrew. And each time a story of a single family was told, and then we would move on. And the march ended on the Umschlagplatz, where the Jewish people were taken to the death camps. And I've sort of filmed most of it on my phone, and I'm gonna work on giving, like, on creating subtitles to those stories and to that whole event, and I'm gonna be uploading in parts that march to YouTube as part of the series on the ghetto events.
Yeah, we have a number of Holocaust museums here in the United States. However, I do not believe. Yeah, I did not see, for example, the big one is in Washington, D.C., and I did not go to it when I was in D.C. back in 2002.
right?
But when I get back out there, I'm definitely going to take a visit there.
Yeah. And I think it's like sort of really important to push against like against indifference. I think that is the biggest message from the whole thing. Not to be indifferent to evil, not to be indifferent to what's happening around us.
Yes, there is I think, a tendency, especially in American history, there's a tendency to forget that what happens around the world does affect us.
Yes, and of course, what happens in the US heavily impacts what happens in, you know,
In Ukraine and
in other
a lot of countries
countries.
where we're partnered with. Uh, so it behooves us to learn each other's histories and learn each other's presence
Yes.
so that we understand one another and are on the same page when the time comes.
And that, like, we must come together in an international movement, especially since the far right is already doing it. The far right is a very international project, and it is time for the more left leaning progressive side to realize it and to start organizing on an international scale as well.
Yes, uh, which has been attempted in the past and actually is a fairly interesting subject in and of itself.
Oh, there's a question. Is that part of the reason Russia claims to be defend descended from the Cossacks? Probably yes, because um, the there's a I was working on a whole video about the Zaporozhian Cossacks, who were of course part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? Like there's this misconception that the Cossacks rebelled. There were Cossacks uprisings. There is a big misconception that the Cossacks rebelled against Poland and Polish people. And the Cossacks rebelled against the nobles and the nobility because the Cossacks basically wanted to be elevated to the noble status, and the nobles refused to give them that status. And that is the core issue which caused the uprisings in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, which of course led to the Khmelnytsky uprising when the Cossacks asked actually Russia for help. You know, they asked to be sort of made servants to Russia. And then a big sort of tension moment happened when the Tsar met with the Cossacks and he he told them to swear loyalty to the Tsar. And they said, well, wait a minute. As we understand it, the king swears loyalty to us as well as we swear loyalty to the king, right? And the Tsar said, like, well, that's not exactly how it works over here, you know?
Yes.
And
Uh,
it sort of led to a desperate attempt at creating the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Commonwealth of the Free Nations, in which Lithuania would be like Kingdom of Poland and the Duchy of Lithuania. It would be its sort of zone within the Commonwealth, and the Cossacks would become like the nobles. But that sort of thing came too late, too little, too late, you know. And Russia at that point, Russia directly intervened and did not allow it to happen. The whole idea died off. What is now Ukraine became split between Russia and the Commonwealth. Eastern and Western Ukraine. Western went to the Commonwealth, Eastern went to Russia, right?
Yes.
And the Commonwealth became crippled basically at that point because the Cossacks were actually a huge force that complemented the other types of warriors in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, they were a fairly significant portion of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's military,
Yes.
and a fairly significant tradition in their military as well. I have a question here from Elfion. What steps might we take to practice left politics on an international level? Traditionally, that has been an effort to kind of, and I think this is important, um, unify labor across international lines. Kind of get labor on the same page and the same objectives. These things fell apart pretty substantially when you had the First World War break out, for instance. Nationalism ended up being surging and kind of overwhelming the international system. But like starting to recognize, like I think, and starting to recognize that the interests of people who are working class tends to dominate much more readily than national interests is, I think, a good first step.
Yes. But I also think that on the level of us as sort of people who can organize support groups that are more internationally oriented, we can, for example, like for what happened with what President Sunday and Diman Mama did for me, I consider
Yes.
to be this sort of international effort to sort of support my mom. And it can take shapes like one group of people or person that is able saying, if you live in a dangerous place, come here and we will take care of you. We will help you to find footing in this place that it's possibly safer than where you are right now. We can organize to secure a passage for you, maybe, help you find your way in this new area, right? Like international support groups. I think that is a big, big component.
Yes. To that end, I would also point out that we have in the Two Guys Talking History Discord, we have a section for mutual aid that if you have someone who's in need or you yourself are in need, if you could put it there so I can see it and I can spread it out and I can talk to people like Lucy and Sunday about it, about seeing if we can do something like similar to what we did for Lucy back in December. Her
Right.
mother needed assistance paying for private care.
Yeah.
So we can leverage our ability as content creators to work with through communities.
Yeah. And then, like, to put it into perspective, like, my mom needed right away rehab, right? Technically speaking, there is a free option, public option to get rehab for free. And today, mom called me and told me that she was today accepted for the free rehab and she can start it next month.
And she's already been in rehab for some time now, correct?
Yeah, but imagine if the fundraiser didn't happen, if I couldn't
Yes.
afford the private thing, and if her actual rehab started next month.
It's a considerable amount of time.
Like 5 months or if not doing the thing that she would not be walking right now, you know?
Right.
And because of what happened, she not only can walk, but she actually ran a bit recently. And everybody around is saying that it's like this miraculous recovery, that it's incredible. And it's because she received the rehab right away without delay. It's crucial, you know?
We can help one another. We can start
Yes,
to leverage our ability as a community. That I think is another really good first step, and probably the most
yes,
concrete step
yes.
is that we can be there for one another.
Solidarity, comrades, as Bluestone said. Yes, that's correct. You know, there's this nice, very interesting within Jewish culture thing. I'm gonna look it up on the wiki and see if that's like the. Are you familiar with the concept of kibbutz?
It's yeah, uh, the Jewish tradition, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
It's like an international community in Israel that was traditionally based on agriculture. The first kibbutz, like,
It's kind of a commune type system.
yes, it's a system of self sufficient community that sort of grows its own food, gets people to fill certain roles that are needed within the community, you know?
Yes, please don't ever ask me to correctly pronounce Hebrew and Yiddish things off the top of my head. I'll fail miserably.
Right. And I think, but because there are some really nice things from the Jewish community historically that we could all learn from. Like, for example, in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, there was a much higher birth rate among Jewish people than among Christians, for example. Do you know why?
No, I'd have to look that one up.
I'm not sure if you'll find right away the answer to that. The answer is because the Jewish community took care of its poorest members and gave like shelter, gave like some sort of housing, took care when it came to medical needs of the poorest members of the community, which of course meant that more children were being born because less children died, which meant that the birth rate became higher than among Christians, for example. It's the
Yeah, that makes sense.
it's the spirit of taking care of the most vulnerable and the poorest members of the community. And I think this is what we need to do.
Yeah, that's like this concept that we talked about. If you've watched our previous videos, I talked with Miss Emily Likens, who has done reproductive justice work in the United States for close on a decade, of this concept of working together and taking care of one another.
Yeah.
It's immensely important. However, we're coming up on a 2 hour mark, and I have to prep out of things. So, do you want to leave with any more thoughts about the ghetto uprising before we conclude this out? Then,
Yes. I think that many people, when they think about the Holocaust, they only think about the death camps. And it is extremely important for people to know about the ghetto, about how people lived in there, about the full story of the people that and their experience in the ghetto. And I think this is why I'm doing the whole series on it to sort of from from many different angles, like and like discussion like this one is part of it, like approaching the topic from different perspectives, from like the shorts that I've uploaded, the short descriptions of certain elements of the ghetto. I think it's
yeah, if
important
you have
to.
not checked it out, Lucy has been posting over the last couple weeks a number of shorts detailing different accounts out of the ghetto. They're very well done, and you should go take a look at them.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, one of them is has a quote from the professor that is now being attacked by the government.
All right. So I want. I
So
think it's
thank you.
important that we kind of highlight the extreme courage that it takes to stand up in these situations and to remember that. Um, but I'd also want to thank Lucy for having me on today,
Thank you for
being with
coming.
us today.
And I think we should do more organized history related stuff together.
We should absolutely. So I also want to thank everyone for showing up today and viewing. If you haven't subscribed to Lucy, subscribe. If you haven't subscribed to me, it would help me out too.
True. I'm
For
gonna
Two Guys
share
Talking
the.
History. And we have Lucy set up in the description of this video. If you haven't, go ahead, pop up in the description box and hit that. The other thing to keep in mind is we will be getting out our May schedule just as soon as me and Hetman sit down and figure it out. And I will be back later this evening on WIC TV to be debating the merits of gun control and the Second Amendment. I will post times for that in our Discord when I finalize them. And with that, I want to thank everybody and have a good day.
Thank you very much.